So welcome and thank you for joining in. I'm Summer Deaver. This is a series that I'm working on called Defiers of Dominant Culture, and specifically the next few episodes I'm going to be speaking with white moms of mixed and brown kids. And today I have with me one of my dear friends, Risa Haynes. She lives in Chicago. She is an incredible mover and shaker, participating in all kinds of beautiful movements in Chicago. And Risa and I met in college. And she is also married to one of my dear friends, a great artist, Eric, or sometimes known as Manny, mostly known as Manny Hayes. And they have an amazing daughter, Ella. And so I invited Risa to come and have this discussion today because meaning me and my daughter, have been really waking up to the social justice movement in the past year. But when I look for guidance and support in where to turn and where to research and where to look, I have a crew of people that I ask for advice, and Risa is like at the top of that list because she's really been in it and doing this work for not just the past year when we've had sort of an awakening in the Black Lives Matter movement and things like that, but Risa has really been just probing away at this for years. So there's a lot that I could say, but I'm sure that we'll get into Risa and her experiences a little bit more. But Risa, thank you for being here. Thanks for recording this with me.
Yeah, thank you for having me, Summer. Think you and I have known each other for like 20 years or longer, actually, 23 years, something like that. And you've known Eric, Manny to everybody else, Eric to me, for pretty much that whole time. So it's a long time.
Yeah. So I wanted to just kind of jump right in because one of my experiences in being in a biracial relationship was that I lived in Fort Greene, Brooklyn, where that's sort of like the norm. And then I didn't actually realize that I was married to a Black man until we moved to New Jersey, and we were standing in line for ice cream somewhere, and a woman grabbed her purse and pulled it closer to her chest. And my reaction was, internally so profound because she didn't know this man at all. And there was no way in hell he's going to snatch her purse. And yet it's this internal like reflex. So was that ever the case? Like, were you always aware that your partner was a person of color?
Yes, I think I was, mostly because we met in, I want to say it was like 1991. No, that's not true. Sorry, 93 or 94 in St. Louis, which is very racially divided. I was going to college there, and we were just friends for a long time. But quite early on in our friendship, I met his family. And I think when you know somebody as an individual, you take them as an individual, but when you meet them in the context of their family, their personhood, who they really are, comes full circle. And in terms of the Black family, quote unquote, Eric comes from the Black family. He comes from a Black family, and they're very deep and many generations of, and they're a family that has been traditionally builders of this country. He's got Tuskegee Airmen and Vietnam veterans. Almost every generation of his family served in the military in America until his generation. So they're very deeply entrenched. They're union folks. His grandfather was treasurer of the Teamsters in the St. Louis area until he retired. I mean, they're very deeply entrenched in like the makings and buildings of America. And with that, they're also like a proud family, a proud Black family, and uphold and hold close their Blackness and wear it like a badge of honor and pride. So I don't think there was ever a moment where I didn't think he was Black, but what that meant over the years has evolved, like what it means to be married to a Black man has evolved for me. But I don't think I was ever colorblind to it.
And so what does that mean to be married to, and like, what does that evolution look like?
Well, that's a good question because we've this year we'll be celebrating our 20-year wedding anniversary. We've known each other probably like 5 years longer than that. So we met when we were about 19. Um, yeah, it's a really good question. It's a big question. It started out, I think, probably, I would say, if I'm being honest, the way maybe a lot of interracial relationships start out, which was I was very likely fetishizing in some way, shape, or form, Eric's otherness and his exotic nature. He's a very, very attractive man with his high cheekbones and, beautiful hair and gorgeous skin color, all of that. But I think looking back, yeah, I was very likely fetishizing that and in love with that idea of being married to somebody or with somebody who wasn't the stereotypical white male norm. Um, as an aside to that, I will say that I have always been a little bit on the different side in terms of like my femininity. I've kept my hair really short for a long time. I've almost never worn makeup. I am physically much more like the physique of I don't know, a 11-year-old boy than a 45-year-old woman. So I did not necessarily fit the ideal of what white men liked anyway. And I knew that pretty early on. I was pretty much told that, from early on in my teenage years by enough white men. So I think very, very young, I started thinking like, maybe white guys aren't for me. And in college in St. Louis, ended up meeting a lot more people of color. And he and I just connected anyway, because he also was and is not a typical person. Like neither one of us are very typical. He it's a lot more sensitive, than a lot of people in general, and very open and passionate in ways that I probably wasn't as familiar with how men act, this type of like deep emotional passion instead of kind of like a stoicism that my father has, and a lot of other white men that I know kind of have this buttoned up stoicism, or at least like controlled emotions or whatever. So those things were, very attractive to me as well. So it wasn't just, I'm not saying it was just me fetishizing him. He was also a very different type of person, a different type of man all the way around. And actually now in 2020 or 2021, we've talked a lot where the gender norms have changed and we have all these new terms, and we both have like determined, had we been young now, we would both be just like queer, right? Like we wouldn't be, we would just be considered queer people. And we were like two queer people that found each other, even though we're kind of cis heteronormal straight folks. Just in the way that we operate in our lives, don't follow social norms. So we also gravitated towards each other for those reasons. So that was early on. And then we came to Chicago. We lived in Georgia for a while, which was like, that's where we met you. And that was a trip because Georgia is incredibly racist and has a deep history of racial oppression. We had some very strange experiences there. At least they were strange for me. I don't know if they were as strange for Eric, but they were very strange for me. And I will mention two of them, and they both happened at the grocery store. One, this is just for context, I was in line at the grocery store and I had like my arms full of groceries. I'd always forgone actually getting a basket or a cart and would just carry things. And I stepped into a long line behind a very tiny Black woman I'm not that big either, but she was even smaller than me. And she turned around and saw me and immediately dropped her eyes to the ground. She was old. She was an older woman. I would say she was probably in her 70s at that time. She dropped her eyes to the ground and she said, please go ahead of me, miss, go ahead of me. And I was like, so confused because I was in my head running through my list of food. Had I gotten everything on my grocery list? And I was like, what? No, it's fine. I don't need to go ahead of you. And she was like, no, please, please, please go ahead of me. And I realized all of a sudden that like I had stepped into this time warp of where this woman at some point in her life had been made to step aside for me. or for people like me. And that freaked me out. And I was like, oh no, I forgot something from my list. And I ran out of the line because it was no way was I going to put this woman behind me, but also it was making her very uncomfortable for me to be behind her. So I just left the line and waited until the line went down and I could rejoin. That was just one experience of the oddness of Georgia. The other one was again with Eric at the grocery store, same grocery store. And we were putting our items on the conveyor belt. And there may have been like a gap of a couple of inches between my stuff and his stuff. It was all our stuff. We were paying for it together. And the person checking us out was a young teenage girl. She was Black. And she got to his stuff. And I said, that we're all together. And she looked at him and she looked at me and she literally physically left the cash register and went and got young teenage boy, a Black boy, teenager that was checking grocery or like bagging groceries from another cash station, brought him over to this cash register to point us out and be like, look at these people, it's two people. And I mean, I think it's important to note too, that at the time Eric had long dreadlocks. He does now as well, but that was very unusual in like 1996 in Athens, Georgia. I think there were 2 Black guys in all of Athens, Georgia that had long dreads. Everybody else had like clean cut haircut. Now it's super common and not even something you would think about, but at the time he stood out. So our experience, so in those moments, it was very strange to me because I was experiencing what it was to be white and what it was to be white with a Black man through the lens of other Black people in the South, which I don't know if I've gotten much of that since then. I've had some experiences here that, people like will kind of shun us, Black women particularly, will kind of give him like a dirty look. It doesn't really faze me. I don't think it fazes him. We operate off of the idea that nobody belongs to anyone. So the concept that I would have taken a Black man from the pool of Black men is pretty absurd because I didn't take anyone. I don't own him, and vice versa. But those are just to give context to like some of the ways that we experienced some racial interactions in Athens. But Eric's also like a big sharer of information. He soundboards off of me a lot. So even if I wasn't around and he had some sort of situation with someone that felt racially motivated, he would share it with me. For example, in Athens, again, he worked at a video store and he was regularly asked, he was a video store clerk, but he was regularly asked by like white kind of fraternity type college boys if he could get them weed constantly. And he like never sold drugs. So that was, it was just like all the white people sold drugs. Like it was the great irony that like the Black guy didn't sell drugs, and never had. So he would share those things with me and be like, it happened again. Like these guys think I'm going to get them some weed. So anyway, fast forward, we moved to Chicago in 2000. And here we've actually had some of the weirder racial interactions with white people. They stick out to us because they're so like stereotypically on the textbook of what you would think. One time we were driving and I'm the driver. I'm always the driver. And so I'm kind of an aggressive, like Texan driver, like I drive with like a ferociousness everywhere. And this guy in like a Beamer or something like that zipped in front of me and cut me off right before a red light. So he cut me off and slammed on his brakes, right? So I slam on my brakes, honk my horn because, honking horns is, what aggressive people do. And the light turned green. He turned the corner, almost hit some pedestrians that were walking across the crosswalk. I turned after the pedestrians passed and, we ended up at the same light at the next block next to each other. And Eric and I, we had our windows down, we were listening to music and we just like looked over at this jerk driver, as one does when they're like glowering at jerky drivers who almost hit pedestrians and cut people off. And the guy's like, this kind of like pissed off white guy, middle age or so. And he's like kind of all red in the face. And he's like, get a white guy to me. And I was like, what? You know, like this is, first of all, you don't know the relationship between me and this person in my car. He is my husband, but you would never be able to know that. He's a passenger in my car. And then he yells to Eric, go back to Africa. And the light turns green and he takes off, which the irony is the next light was red. So we end up right next to him again, after he's done this ridiculous, like stereotypical textbook white wet dream of being able to blow off your racial steam at the black man. And then we ended up on the highway and, we went our separate ways. He went up to the north side of Chicago and we took off to the west side. So that was we still talk about that because it was such a bizarre, like, I don't know, it seemed like a fantasy of what people, the fact that the two of us just sitting in a car together could irritate somebody so much that they would want to yell things like that at strangers was just odd. It's like that, those people have issues, but that's, again, I think, like, we'll probably move into this. That's kind of a part of the white pathology, is that you have the right to do and say those kind of things. But truly, over the course of 20 years, to your first question about like how I have experienced or come to realize about being married to a black man and what that means, it's like a constantly evolving learning thing. I had to learn about whiteness to learn more about blackness. You can't know one without the context of the other. Race is a completely made up construct. There is no biological difference between us as humans, right? It's a melanin factor. That's it. There's no difference between any of us. So yeah, we have features that might look different, but as a species, we are all exactly made of the same matter and put together in the same.
Isn't that interesting though? Because it's so like historically programmed into us, this concept that there is some sort of biological difference,
Yeah, it's very intentional.
Has been what has perpetuated race, right? And racism and slavery and all the things that like tend to be wrong with our country. And so I think, like, I'm curious about, like, my first question, like, when in regards to sort of this almost like spiritual bypassing, or this like, oh, I don't see race, or love is blind, and I'm not really even aware that I'm married to a black man, or like that kind of an attitude that I personally had. And like the feeling of not really needing to look deeper or do the work is where I see a lot of white people like still residing. It's like, oh, you're making the situation worse by actually looking at it so closely or digging so deeply into it. You're like you're picking at the wound kind of attitude.
Yeah.
But why do you feel that it's necessary for us to do this kind of work that I know you're so committed to, in terms of really understanding whiteness and then understanding what it is to be Black in America?
Yeah, well, I mean, big one for me is, I have a Black daughter. We can call her biracial, but the world will see her as Black, whenever they feel like it. So I refer to her as Black. I mean, she knows she has a white mom, so we have those nuanced conversations, but I want her to understand and feel and embrace what it means to be a Black woman as well, or, a Black girl, and wake up and grow up proud of that, not feel like that's something that you have to wear as a shield, but something to be proud of. It is a complicated situation to try to wade through that feeling of people saying like you're picking at a scab. But leaving the scab alone has done nothing for people of color, Black, brown, and Indigenous in this country. And it's all on us. It's all on white people to do the work. Like, Black folks, they know their history. They know their history, and they know white people better than white people know white people. So, it's a lot to have to hold, and it's not fair. We should have to hold that as well. And, whatever discomfort we sit with is nothing compared to the actual lived oppression that Black and brown people wake up with and go to sleep with every day. And, we can wish it away all we want. That's not how it works. Things change because of actual work and putting in the time to educate yourself, and having hard conversations with people, being asked to being asked if you're allowed to be involved in these conversations, and also not abusing the kindness of Black and brown folks who do all this emotional labor on behalf of white people. That's a huge one that I see. And it's actually kind of like step one. If you look online and you hang out in Facebook groups and things like that, you'll see that's kind of like step one in the education process, is like, stop asking Black people to do all the work for you. There's a whole thing called the internet. Go Google some things, like, and then they'll say, well, what do I Google? And, people are like, are you kidding me? Get on the Google and just, type in some stuff and start there. But to your question about, observing what race is, I personally, like, because Eric and I have talked about this for a long, long time, I did a lot of the emotional work of feeling like I was the spokesperson for white people, and like being a sounding board for him, to be his safe space to talk about how white people made him feel. It took a long time for me to hear that without personifying it or personalizing it. I would cry and I would be like, but what do we do to change it? Again, kind of asking him to do all the labor and figure out the steps. And he was just trying to emote and be, a human in the moment. And I was like asking him to give me the guidebook to how to make everything different and better. And that's just not realistic either. Every Black person, like I said earlier, and white person is not going to be a spokesperson for Blackness or whiteness. So everybody will have a different idea of how that path looks. But for me, I stumbled upon a podcast called Seeing White a few years ago, and really listened intently to the whole thing and got very absorbed into it, because it's a great podcast. And then I listened to several episodes again multiple times to really try to absorb the nuances of historically how race was designed, because it was not a thing. Thousands of years ago, people had affiliations with their culture, with the country they came from. If you were Black and French, you were French. You weren't Black French. It's a very relatively new concept. America is just entirely built on it. So we cling to it the way we cling to all sorts of mythologies. One time I saw somebody say, apple pie, slavery is older than apple pie. So like slavery is as American as apple pie, or apple pie is as American as slavery, something like that, and I was like, oh, that really hits kind of hard, because we have this idea about what America is, but most of us are really wrong in terms of how it was built. The reality is the entire foundation and fundamental financial success of this country was built off of the backs of people. And we wouldn't have what we have now, which is funny to say in 2021 because we're such a shit show, but we wouldn't have what we have now financially if it hadn't been for the fact that we imported millions of people and worked them to death in order to build up, a money, I don't even know how to describe it, but, build up like a currency concept, and then bury that whole story for our own cultural needs as white people.
Yeah.
There's some really fascinating things when you start to dig through the layers of how race has been legislated in this country. That stuff is like mind blowing. That's really where I got very caught up, and those were some of the doors that blew open things for me, and made me realize like, oh, I need to rethink this whole thing.
Yeah, Lula and I are reading Stamped from the Beginning right now, and it's an amazing book. It's written for like middle school, high school kids, and it's a history of basically America told through the lens, or basically a history of racism in America. And it's powerful, and I would like it would be amazing if that was what kids are taught in school, but we know like what's taught in Texas in history is different than what's taught in New York State, and the sort of like inequities that exist in our world are like vast. And when you're talking about like doing this work and the sort of waking up and how it's like this personal journey and just like starting, Um, what do you feel like, especially for white women in America? Like, what do you feel like the initial signs? We kind of talked about this a little bit prior to this recorded conversation, but like we mentioned sort of these stages, like in the beginning, there's almost like a resistance or like a defensiveness, and then there might be like this guilt, and then there's sort of like these layers. And can you talk a little bit about that journey and getting to like, because I know you've expressed on many occasions that you're at this place of like, not taking everything personally and just being able to hear something or reflect or see how people are treated and be open to it. And then, oh yeah, cool, I do that. I need to change that. Maybe not cool, but like, wow, yeah, I'm gonna work on that.
Yeah, I think that's like a lot of things, it's a practice, right? Like you as a yoga practitioner, you probably meditate and do yoga every day and you probably don't even really have to think about it anymore. For me, but I'm sure it wasn't like that in the beginning. You needed to create a practice. I kind of look at everything like that now, and particularly when it comes to things like this. Like if my first reaction to something is to be like, oh no, that's totally wrong, then I'm probably being reactive and defensive. It could be right, it could be wrong, but it could be right, and it bears more uh, thoughtfulness on my part to sit with that. Yeah, I certainly my own personal journey definitely started with a lot of guilt, a lot of denial, and then guilt. And then guilt was a long phase, sadly for the people around me that probably had to put up with that because that's very centering on my own feelings. Guilt was a really long phase. I would probably put it somewhere around a decade, no joke. And being reactionary and crying and having a lot of sadness about it. But I think that was before I really dug into historically where race was created and the facts. I was still very much existing in like an emotional state of like, oh, slavery is bad and it's gross and ooh, I don't like all of this. And it makes me feel icky as a white person and as a white woman, and I'm not that person, and all of those responses that people, I mean, you literally like, we all go through those, right? That's not me. I'm not like that. I can't be that. I the whole myriad of things, but ultimately when I finally made it through some of that, which I think probably therapy helped, not specifically for race related stuff, but just like learning how to own my feelings through therapy was very powerful. Once I got past that and realized like feelings are something that you can just hold in your hand and observe, and then like step back from a little bit and say like, oh, okay, you're serving me or you're not, right? Then I was able to let go of a lot of that. People talk about that, being able to do that from all sorts of perspectives, putting a stone into a river and letting it like sink to the bottom and letting go of your feelings, or like releasing these things. But from there, I was able to move into like a more educational standpoint. And that is strictly because of the time period that we're living in, having the internet at our access and having things where having race become a public conversation, and having smart people all over this country and planet who are many, many decades and generations invested in this information and have gathered this information and then put it together in such a way as to be absorbable, like you were saying, reading Ibram Kendi X's Stamp from the Beginning. That's, a great entryway for a lot of people because it is readable. You can absorb it, you can digest it. It's not heavy-handed. You get farther into some of this and you end up in things like Mothers of Mass Resistance. And I mean, some of these are like really heavy texts that require, at least for me, rereading the same passages over and over again. It could take me a year to go through something like that. And I still haven't made it through a lot of those books because of like the heaviness. It's much more academically written versus like written for the layperson. That's why for me, I did like really get a lot out of podcasts. I get a lot from hearing things. I think I absorb information better that way. So some of it is like finding out which way you absorb information and then making sure you're ingesting it in the way that best sits in your brain. But yeah, moving into more of an educational standpoint and realizing like it's my responsibility to educate myself and then also like help educate other white people. So like a lot of Black and brown people aren't doing the heavy lifting. Admittedly, my my techniques, my tactics tend to be like much more brash than what the average white person would want it to be. Um, I'm like a wrecking ball, you know, I'm like trying to break through everything. And like most people want to be kind of hit with the pillow. They don't want to be hit with the wrecking ball. But I also, you know, I mean, I'm not an educator in any way, shape, or form. Like I don't take that on, but my own personal tactics, I refuse to adjust those for other people's comfort levels, because you're either ready to get that information or you're not. I don't necessarily think it's my job or any one of our jobs to like pick up every single person who's lagging behind and bring them ahead. Sometimes you have to walk ahead and be like, hey, catch up. You know, that's just where I am. And I've learned a lot of that mostly from following Black and brown and Indigenous activists online who do not change their language for white people at all. And they're, you know, when somebody tells you to catch up, you can decide to stay behind or you can catch up. And I've more recently risen to the challenge of wanting to catch up and like really challenge myself on a lot of those things. But yeah, I think white women start from a place of guilt and, you know, oh, sadness and all those hurts and it doesn't feel good. And that's a lot of our white pathology revolves around this idea that like we as white people are supposed to be allowed to feel good all the time, constantly. Like that's our God-given right, is to feel good about everything. And anything that challenges that is immediately suspect, questionable. And you know, I'm sure you may have seen this, and I've seen this over and over again as a, you know, homeschooler. People try to piece together their own curriculums constantly, and they're very much interested in like racial education now and historical impacts of race in this country. But they're also more concerned with how sensitive their white children are to the subject matter. And I respect that, because I understand sensitive can mean a lot of different things in children. But I always think about like all of the Black and brown and Indigenous children who are sensitive and don't get to be that, because these white kids over here aren't getting the education they need to be culturally sensitive to the Black, brown, and Indigenous kids. You know, whose children are more important? Are they all important? You know, I see that a lot. So I think white women, we have a lot to do when it comes to like not making excuses for doing the hard work, particularly for ourselves, our families, and our kids.
Oh yeah, and that's the thing, is like when you do have a Black kid, when you do have someone in your home, you don't get to turn it off, you know. And there's sort of this privilege that I do see in my family friends that are in all white households and communities, that it's like, oh, that's so challenging, Summer, you know. And but then it's like, yeah, click, change the channel, you know, and then
Right.
go back to white people problems. And yeah, I don't necessarily have a way in which we ignite, you know, like this kind of compassion, really, because it's wanting to relieve the suffering of an entire group of people, you know. And it's like, how do we peel the layer back from, you know, the blinders on the horse, so that it can like really see like what's been going on for generations. And I don't, I feel like sometimes it's personal stories that like really strike at the emotion of individuals, and especially white women, to ignite that sort of desire to want to do the work. And it's loving a brown person, you know, it's loving a person of color, it's loving Black, Indigenous, and um, you know, like all the friends that are close, and keeping them close and wanting them to have a place at the table, like not to just be comfortable, like you've mentioned this a few times, but the ways in which we try to like assimilate, you know. And having children that are Black, like it's easy for us to get them into a private school, right? It's easy for them to be the like token Black kid on like the flyer of the, you know, the private school, or the whatever, and I'm like guilty of that in a lot of ways, is like getting my child into these like privileged situations, um, because she is a child of color, and then she's like a little underserved also in that. She's like, I don't know where I fit in. I've like grown up in this white world, and there's not really a place for her to fully express who she is, because we're always asking people of color to be palatable, to not be too much, to not express so much. And I know you've said this about Eric, and this is also what I know of him, is to be a very passionate individual, and there's times when we, in a white kind of cultures, like there are these like expectations that everyone sort of does hold their emotions close to their chest, that men aren't passionate and expressive, or that if they are, there's a threatening quality to that. It's uncomfortable. I feel afraid. And like understanding, I think that that's a cultural thing we've inherited, to be afraid of like the passion and the expression of people of color. And
Yeah, but it's the same token, we overlook constantly the violence and like completely unacceptable social behavior of white people constantly. Like if you look the internet and go through like the crazy video, vines or whatever, they're not vines anymore, but like the TikToks and stuff like that. Vines, that's how old I am. And I didn't even have those either. But if you go look through that, like Ella and I'll watch those sometimes, and I'm like, freaking white people, man. This white people stuff is crazy. Like they do the dumbest things. They get really drunk and act a fool in public and get away with it. Videos of like wasted white women falling into the bushes and getting stuck there, and everybody just thinks it's hilarious and helps her up. But meanwhile, some black kids are at a pool party, and the cops show up and put their knee on the back of the black girl, this black teenager's back, and she's in a bikini, and she's like 14 and like barely made out of anything. She's this tiny little girl, and that's okay too. We can, there's a pathology there in our whiteness of what we find tolerable. I mean, it's pretty much like, unfortunately, I don't know if it's unfortunate, but it's just like going through a lot of this education for myself has kind of like killed a lot of that for me. I look back at myself as those people. I mean, I was never like the person who got wasted and fell over. That just wasn't me. But like acting foolish, acting really ridiculous, like absorbing all of the attention in the room and being like loud and brash and just like, I'm here and I'm going to be stupid and I could do this. And getting away with it over and over and over again. I could still do it to this day. I could go out and act totally insane on the street and get away with it. Nobody would even think twice. And not realizing that like in that there is a sort of violence of acceptance of that, where we don't even give Black and brown folks the opportunity to get upset about how they're being treated. You hear it over and over again from especially those incredibly law-abiding citizens, I'm sure, that say like, if they would have just complied, if they would have just gone along, when in reality, sometimes people are at their breaking point. They don't want to go along anymore, or things are incredibly unfair. And if they were happening to us, we would be incensed as well. There's a certain, I just always come back to like that idea that there's like a certain violence in the white pathology of trying to explain everything away if it's white and making a lot of excuses for it, and then trying to find every reason why it's okay for Black and brown people to be treated the way they are. And I'm talking on an individual level. If we look at systemic stuff, that's completely ingrained in our entire society. And I believe part of the reason why white folks have such a hard time moving the dial a little bit, because for everybody to be free, some people have to give up some stuff. It's a fact. You might lose your ability to have the place at the school. You might lose your ability to have the piece of property that you think you deserve, or the job you think you deserve, if we make room for everyone. White people are like the default to everything. And then like we allow the Black and brown people to trickle in and like fill in the gaps. But there's oftentimes I mean, I can't think of the last job I've had where I had like a Black manager, that always goes to a white woman 99.9% of the time, or a white man. And the Black folks kind of get to have these peripheral roles, but they're also the ones that get blamed for things. As soon as the stuff starts to roll downhill, everybody goes, oh, this is on them. I've made really good friends with most of the Black folks that I work with, and they express those things to me. I've watched people leave jobs because they knew that the problems were coming. They foresaw them, and they knew they were going to land on them. They knew the white folks were going to like dodge it, and it was going to like bam, come and smack down right on them. And I imagine that, I know my husband's gone through that too. I imagine that that's probably part of my daughter's future. So I feel really like, not just for her, but for Lula, for all of the people I don't know, I feel like it's important to beat the drum and not accept what our bosses and coworkers and relatives say. I think that's one of the most challenging things that white people probably come up on. And I think you mentioned that a little bit, like, with family members that might be like, that sucks. Click, change the channel. There's a certain white pathology that comes from generational wealth. People will tolerate a certain level of crap and racism and bigotry and hatred from their own family members, because there's a high likelihood that they are going to be the recipient of some sort of generational wealth at the end of that other person's life. I personally know, I can name, but I will not, a couple of people who are right now very, good old friends of mine who directly benefit from the wealth and benevolent nature of some very racist family members. And luckily for them, they're not married to Black men. They probably wouldn't be getting that generational wealth if they were. But they, that turning a blind eye is just as violent as any screaming or throwing bricks at windows that we describe as violence to property in this country. I think the summer of 2020 really showed us like what people, particularly neoliberal white people, tend to think about violence, right? Oh, don't break the window, of the building on behalf of feeling incredibly angry about 400 plus years of oppression. We all watched on camera a man have his life taken from him with a person's knee on their neck, and all the people standing there felt completely paralyzed to be able to do anything about that. That is a violence beyond having to watch that and then talk about it. And all, like all of the Black people I know lived that moment. Like they felt all of that. It was super painful. It makes me want to cry right now, of course, because it's a terrible thing to think about. We don't do that, like white folks, we don't absorb that cultural experience the same way. We get to experience all the joys and the happiness and like, yeah, woo, we won the game and our team won and like the person we're voting for won and all of that. Like we live off of these like good feelings, but we don't really sit with the negative and the dark and the ugly enough to process and like absorb that as part of our humanity. And maybe that's getting like really far out there, but you had mentioned saying, having a Black child and loving Black people. And, I say like, open that up and like, we have to learn to love people, right? We shouldn't have to know somebody to love them. We should be able to love people because they have the right to be loved. And that, I think, really goes back to the American educational system and training about who is worthy in this country, who's fully human. It started it started at the inception of who is fully human. We rolled into this country, colonizers and Europeans rolled into this country and killed people right away, calling them savages and less than, right? And now here we are in 2020, like, oh shit, maybe we should have listened to the indigenous people about the earth. We've really screwed things up quite a bit, but who could stop it now? We're on a roll, there's we've got a lot to do to get back to the point where we just like absorb and recognize people as fully human and and we don't have to like them. You don't have to like somebody. They just have the
Yeah.
right to be fully human.
Well, it's in a lot of ways like there's so many layers to that, but like this white Christian savior complex, of like people that aren't white, are savages in some way, or there's a different shape to the brain, or there's a different genetic makeup. And all these things we know are lies. Science has proven that they do not exist. And
Yeah.
um, but there's still, like, even as a white person, I see myself, and I show up, in full disclosure of like, there is that white savior complex. Like, why am I making this podcast? Like, why, or this, recording? Like, what is the intention behind it? And all I know really is that there's like, like you said, it's like this is my child's life, and this is not meant to be for um, people of color, really. This is meant to be like, hey, white people, hey, white women, like, you know, we have so much privilege and so much opportunity. I feel like the Dalai Lama at one point said it's going to be like the white woman of the West that saves the world. And I remember reading a marketing report a few years ago saying that the yoga mom is like the new soccer mom, that all marketing materials, because like white women like hold the power of buying for the families, really. And so like Whole Foods has been marketed to us, Amazon Prime has been marketed to us. Like, these huge monopolies of companies that exist today they're geared towards us. So if we were to like collectively wake up and band together like white women, and create a revolution and be like, we are going to end racism in our lifetime, then we could do it, because we hold so much potential power. And whether that's like saying, okay, cool, like a handful of us are going to work on what companies we actually invest in, and the companies that have like these, significant equity policies, and have diversity and inclusion, specialists that work at their organizations and are working in this, and we're going to put our money into that. We're going to convince, the people who are influential to invest in that particular way, or and there's just like a million ways that we could potentially come together and influence, whether that's through education. And like, I wanted to invite you to share a little bit about like mutual aid. And so Risa is doing this beautiful project in Chicago with Eric, her partner, and Ella, their daughter. She's out there doing it too. And it's a mutual aid project, and it's called Love Fridge. And they have 22 refrigerators all throughout Chicago, where people can go, and they don't have to ask, and they don't have to stand in line in a food line. They can go whenever they need to, as discreetly or as openly as they want, to a fridge and get real food. And that to me is equity. And the structure of how you guys are doing it in terms of mutual aid is authentic equity, because none of you are making money, and you guys are all like putting in like 40 hours a week or more. And it's just like, I don't know, I just, in those moments when I hear you guys talk about that, I'm just like, wow, what a like privilege to know you, like that you've gone from this place of like shame and guilt and really challenging conversations to educating yourself around whiteness and blackness and the history of America, um, and your husband's family and their history and the rich, beautiful like culture that exists in your family, and then taking that and that work, then transforming into this movement that's really transforming Chicago, and yeah. So I would love, first, can you explain what a mutual aid actually is, because I don't know how many people know what that is.
Sure. Yeah, mutual aid is, in our estimation of it, it's where you collectively join together with members of your community. In this case, because we're all city, our mutual aid group serves the entire city of Chicago, and we're starting a couple of fridges in the suburbs as well, the near suburbs. And eventually it'll just be everywhere. It'll probably be like this whole life of its own, and who knows what will happen. But mutual aid is essentially where members of the community come together to share their gifts in a way where if I have something that you need, I can give it to you. And if you have something that you need, you can give it to me. And so we've set that up around food scarcity and food insecurity. Typically in Chicago, areas were called food deserts. That language has been reframed a bit so that now we're referring to it as food apartheid, because that's really what it is. It's systemic and it's intentional. A desert kind of sounds like something that, like, was already there. No, these communities had food. They had businesses, they had grocery stores, they had money circulating in the community, and they were systemically oppressed and intentionally oppressed by the powers that be in Chicago, the political machine and the police and corporations. So it's very intentional, as apartheid was intentional, as it was a policy. So we've kind of reframed that, and I appreciate that reframing of that, because it sounds less passive. It sounds like something that's been done so it can be undone, But yeah, mutual aid is essentially, in our estimation, it's solidarity, not charity. So a charitable model would say, like, oh, we're going to start a 501c3 not-for-profit, and we're going to maybe observe for 6 months what the community needs, and then we're just going to provide that one thing. We're going to like trickle it down to you, and up here at the top, we're going to take our salary, our 30% cut of whatever grants and funding we get, and then we'll like trickle the rest down. Eventually, maybe it'll get to you. Mutual aid is a lot more direct. So we have funds that are given to us, and we, like, as quickly as possible, turn them back around and push them back out into the community, and create a model where money and resources are flowing in and quickly moving back out. We don't sit really on anything. We do some supply drives, and sometimes we hold some supplies in storage, but very briefly, just so that we have a little lull in the weather. We don't want to put a bunch of toilet paper out into a pantry and it gets wet, that kind of thing. So that's mutual aid in a nutshell. Is basically like people coming. Mutual aid's been practiced for thousands of years. It's a traditional practice of how communities were run. Whatever you needed, somebody else would take care of it for you. If you needed somebody to watch your kid for a few hours while you went and like collected water or seeds or berries or whatever, you could do that. That was a trade-off. Everybody just like naturally did that. We've lost that in our culture because we're a capitalist culture. And so you're not supposed to get something for nothing, right? In our culture, there's supposed to be some like equal trade. Mutual aid doesn't require an equal trade. If there is one to be given, then that's fine. But in our case, with our community fridges, almost all of them are 24/7 access. You don't need to have an ID or anything. You could walk up to the fridge, in your birthday suit. It's kind of gross, but you could come to the fridge in any state that you're in and get food. And there's nobody there like policing it or anything like that. So if there's food in there, you're welcome to take it. And if there's not, you're welcome to leave it. And so that's really the main thing, is to encourage people that have. There's a lot of people that have. We've come to find out in 2020, even with so many of us being unemployed, there's still quite a few people who have a lot of money and a lot to give. And they want to give, and they want to find meaningful ways to give. So putting food in fridges or in pantries has been really, I think, a positive impact for people that have and people that don't have. The really beautiful thing is to see it expand in communities where maybe culturally that was already a part of the fabric. They just didn't have the vehicle to do that, right? Things would have been, you could go volunteer at your local charity or something like that. But having a refrigerator in a neighborhood on the south side, we have a fridge in Inglewood at a community garden, and Inglewood is like the number one neighborhood that you hear about in Chicago when you hear about like the bad neighborhood. Literally, it's the neighborhood that gets all of the bad press. But Inglewood is actually a really deep community in Chicago, and historically Black. It's been totally oppressed. And now, of course, now that the prices have all been pushed down and there's so much like entropy on things falling apart, because every block in Inglewood just about has like 3 houses that are boarded up or empty lots where there used to be a building and now there is not. Now there's like this reinvestment in the community. So, those kind of fridges and those kind of places, the neighborhood takes care of it. It's amazing. We're not vendors, so we get donations and we put food in, but like I show up at that fridge and that fridge is almost always full. It's never empty. It's never completely empty. So even though there's a ton of scarcity and that is 100% the neighborhood experiencing food apartheid, the neighbors in that community regularly roll through and put food in the fridge, and from other neighboring communities. It's really a pretty amazing thing to see. And we see that, in our West Side neighborhoods too. The North Side neighborhoods, we definitely see it as well, but they're doing like kind of a payback for the gentrification that they've done in the neighborhood. They've like outpriced people who traditionally lived in that neighborhood. And now they're like putting food and supplies into a community fridge kind of as retribution for that, for displacing people. I'm sorry, I might have lost the thread of what I was talking about for a second, Summer. But yeah, mutual aid is, I think it's in this context, it's for me, given me an opportunity as a, unemployed due to COVID person, so almost 10 months unemployed now. It's given me an opportunity to fulfill my social needs because I do like run into people at fridges. I do all the food distribution, organizing for the Love Fridge. But really I wouldn't be here if it wasn't for Eric, because Eric is the like socially minded, like community minded person of the family. I was the total capitalist. Like I go to work, I earn money. I have this like total frou-frou shishi job of massaging people at the best, most expensive spa in Chicago and, working on celebrities and all of this stuff. I was very far removed from this world of altruism. So he again, it's just the way he was raised. He opened the door when this opportunity came to Chicago. He was one of the first people to jump on it. His friend that brought the idea from New York proposed it and he jumped on it right away. And I did not get along with it right away. I was like, I don't know. I mean, I like the idea, but I wasn't like all in. And then a few months later, there was an opportunity as it grew, for me to kind of step into a role where I could be in charge of something. And that's like my entire dream, is for people to just hand me over the reins and let me do things the way I want to do them. So I was like, yes, I will take on the lead food distribution. And that's put me in a regular rotation of going through like 15 neighborhoods across Chicago. And of course, all the ones in between as I drive around. But yeah, I've lived here for 20 years and I've gotten to know this city so much better in the last 3 months, and places that I was just thinking about this the other day as I was driving from like Bronzeville, which is a historically Black neighborhood on the near south side of Chicago, over to Inglewood. I was driving down this street that I drive frequently, and I was like, this feels familiar now. Like I've done this drive a lot of times now, and now this feels like I'm taking, this is my neighborhood too. There's that barbershop I always pass, and like there's that one community garden, and I'm starting to get that familiarity with it. That is like that's like the standard for building community, is to feel like you belong somewhere and to make other people feel like they belong somewhere. So even though that's not my community, I've never lived in Bronzeville, I'm not ever going to live in Inglewood. We actually live in the suburbs of Chicago, the near west suburbs of Chicago. Recently, we lived there in the city for 20 years. I feel community with all of these places. And in each place, I've gotten to know the neighbors as I drop off food, and I have like conversations with people from a distance. It's COVID. So it's, it's a, hey, how's it going? And they know me now. I show up, and within a few minutes of stocking a fridge, folks are, like, hey, are you done? Can I come get some food? They know what I'm there for. They know my car, and not just me, all these other drivers too. And likewise, I've been put into community with other like-minded people who want to be of service, who have, like myself, time on their hands. And, the privilege of, having unemployment from the government so we can do things like still drive around in our cars and use our idle time in service. And I've actually found like I didn't realize that was something that I would love to do as much as I do. I'm not sure if I would even love it as much if I got paid for it. Sometimes I think I would love it more if I got paid for it, but I'm not sure. I think there's I think there's like just a certain, you know, a certain bit of satisfaction in doing something because it needs to be done. Not like I don't want any shine from it. The media hits us up pretty regularly, and I field a lot of the I traffic a lot of the email also. And anytime we get a request for anything media related, my first thought is like, who can I send this to? Like, which one of our fridge hosts or partners or businesses who are hosting a fridge or people who are giving us food can I like move this media attention over to? Because it's not me, it's not about me. That's, you know, it's all for me, all of this is about amplification of the neighborhoods, of the people, because when you see that it's just really like a bunch of normal people doing this, it feels very much more manageable. Like, oh, I could do that too. And you could just jump in for one day, or you could jump in for like months. You know, some of our regular drivers that I deliver food with have been doing this with me since September without fail. Every week, every Wednesday, they show up and let me tell them what to do, which is hysterical to me. And then we like all split off and go wherever. And, you know, we reconvene the next week, or at the end of the day, we'll like check in with each other and tell each other what happened at each fridge. But yeah, this idea, I think, of mutual aid, of building community, is a natural step in equity. Like we were saying, you have to be involved, actually involved in something. When you're like 10,000 feet above looking down, you don't have the same interactions with people. You're not able to like maybe necessarily humanize people the same way as when, in my case, I take food to a refrigerator and put it in there and like meet the person or talk to a person who's food insecure at that time, or maybe they're not even food insecure, you know.
Yeah, I think too, like that idea too. It's like it's not about us reading all the books, right? And becoming like, because we can do that too, like as white people, and you and I especially, like I know we can do that because we like to read and we like to talk and discuss things. So it can be like this sort of end to racism can be this like intellectual game, you know, for white people. It can be oh, I'm accumulating so much knowledge and I've read this and I've done that. And um but like what you just said is really important, is like this concept of like mutual aid, in terms of whether that's amplifying Black businesses and voices and culture and people and music and art, whether it's seeing the need, you know, in the community and then banding together to serve that. It's like that's how we take it out into the world, and that's how we make it an equitable situation. And I think it's all of these pieces. Like it's sitting with the uncomfortableness that you spoke about, and it's doing the education. Like I know you've said before, like you listen to this podcast, but you also, I know from experience, you've gone like outside of that. Like you've heard something on the podcast and then dug deeper. And you know, like I mentioned before, like you and Eric are just like these amazing resources, like whether it's digging deep into like court cases, like we haven't even really touched on that, but you guys have just really done so much when it comes to the education piece. And then like seeing this sort of like fruition where it is this like that heartfelt sense of like, this is my community, even though I don't live here, and even though I don't, you know, I'm never going to live here. These are my people, and I'm taking care of what needs to be taken care of in this community, just as easily as I would watch, you know, someone else's kids for mom to go pick berries.
Right.
And yeah,
Yeah, it turned a lens for me back on like what I wasn't doing in my own community. You know, like I live out here. We moved from the city into like this near west suburb that's like very working class, you know, middle class suburb, and we've lived here for 18 months, and like I know my neighbors on either side of me, and that's about it. I'm in some Facebook groups and stuff like that, so I know people through Facebook, and you know, have had conversations with folks that way. But just yesterday I
But
joined
hold on, I also want to mention that you're like the most amazing like horticulture like
oh,
cultivator of plants. And Risa, she's like, I don't know my neighbors, but she also trimmed like every single one of her exotic house plants and like gave away clippings to anyone in the neighborhood that wanted to come pick them up.
I did, and they traded me for all of their plants. And I still never really met any of them because it was COVID and we did a porch pickup. So I had like a box on my front porch where I was like, I had everybody's plants labeled in bags and they would just like drop off their peppers and I would give them my string of pearls or whatever we were trading. Yeah. So ironically, like even through that process, I didn't even really meet people, but I did yesterday join my first neighborhood mutual aid group, which I didn't even know existed. I wasn't even looking for it. Like I'm still, even with being involved in this love fridge and going all over Chicago and feeling like I'm not hyper local. Like I'm all city. I'm always everywhere. And I've kind of always been that way since we lived here. But it dawned on me recently, this last week, that like maybe I should try to find out if Berwyn, Cicero, where we live, Berwyn, has a mutual aid group. And they do. And it's been in existence for a long time. And the guy that runs it is like a totally my kind of person, has a mouth like a sailor, totally cuts through all the crap, not real, it's not a real touchy-feely kind of guy. But he really gets mutual aid. And so I joined their meeting last night, and that, maybe I added more on my plate than I even have time for, but I'm super excited to have like a hyper local connection to now and understand more about like local politics, because that all drives these policies
Yeah.
that impact people. And I mean, that is something that I'm like way outside of the knowledge of. I'm not looking at like housing. I grasp what it is. I grasp like housing and tenant issues, but I'm not looking at that. I'm very like food focused right now.
But
And
policy is like still part of it. I
it's
feel
totally
like
hard.
that's the work these days is the personal work, and then the action or like the local work, and then there has to be work in policy.
Yeah. And mutual aid gives you an opportunity to not have to hold all of those roles yourself. Like when I was in this mutual aid group last night, there were 3 people who were running for alder person in my area, different alder people in their wards. And they're incredibly knowledgeable about policies and the politics of each of their wards and the makeup of each of their wards. Like I'm 18 months in this neighborhood. I don't know that much. So I deferred to them. I just used them as like a wonderful resource of being like, if you have a minute, explain things to me. And then we found ways that we can work together. I live in a neighborhood that happens to have probably close to 40 little lending libraries. You know what I'm talking about? The
little
library
on the side of the street.
Yeah. And so in Chicago, we have a group called Neighbor to Neighbor into In Literacy, Neighbor to Neighbor Literacy. And they're like the big not-for-profit, well, they're not huge, but they're like the not-for-profit that kind of stimulates all of this. And then there's a couple of smaller not-for-profits that actually build the boxes and go install them in tandem with Into In, who provides books. And gets all these like book donations. So anytime a library is getting empty, you can just like hit them up and be like, hey, the library at such and such is empty. And they'll like, within a day, somebody will be over there with a bunch of varieties of books and fill it up. Super cool, but my neighborhood has like tons of these little lending libraries. And one of the guys last night in the meeting said, like, I'm thinking about for January, February, March, trying to reach out to all of these little lending library homeowners, the people that own the property that they're on, and seeing if we can transfer these into little lending pantries. And I was like, oh, you're speaking my language. Like I actually have access to thousands of pounds of pantry food a week. I mean, the amount of food that we receive is considerable. And I would love to like drive to my neighborhood at the end of the day with an SUV full of canned goods and pantry goods and like give it to 5 other neighbors, meet somewhere, and we like fan out and hit every one of these little lending libraries and turn them into pantries, and keep that up. Like we could do that a couple times a week. So I got very excited about that. Like, wow, the mutual, I could, what I'm already doing, I can like bring it back into my neighborhood and be hyper local. There's a little lending library, 5 houses down. So that would be mine. I would adopt that one and keep that pantry full. And hopefully like inspire other people on their blocks to do the same thing. And truly, like that's what this project with the Love Fridge has shown me, is that if you give people an opportunity to help one another without any, without needing to hit a checklist of reasons why that person deserves help, without needing to prove that they're needy, or whatever the metrics are of your trauma that you have to wear on your sleeve to prove that you need something for free, like food, that's a human right. If you give people the opportunity to do that, they will rise up to that opportunity every single time. Like, we have no failures with any of our fridges. We have no fridges that people have, there's no graffiti on them. Nobody's like ripped out the compressor or tried to steal the fridge or trashed it. I mean, sometimes the pantries get banged around a little bit and the fridge gets dirty, but we have fridge managers. We have, I mean, the neighborhood, people like clean up all the time. They find a dirty, they're like, I'm going to adopt this fridge, and they'll go like clean the fridge. When you give people the opportunity to do that, they naturally do it. And then I think that helps like break down that idea that you need to know someone to want to help them. You don't need to know people to want to help them. You don't need to be a charitable model that's like, I'm going to decide for you what you need, but you don't need to actually like hear somebody's trauma story to know they need to eat. Everyone needs to eat. I regularly take food from the fridges because I'm driving food around all the time, and sometimes I don't have time to go grocery shopping. So like, I'll grab a couple of carrots and some celery and some potatoes and a bag of lentils from the fridge, from like various pantries as I go to them, so I can make some lentil soup. It's kind of ideal. I mean, Eric and I kind of laugh about it. We're not trying to, there's not a metric for who needs food. We all need food, and I think once you start to like recognize that things like this aren't about being needy, just like the little lending libraries, everyone in this neighborhood could probably afford to go buy books, and we have an actual library, but like, books are, food for your brain. Everybody deserves to have a little library on their block and, have books at their access. And every kid should be able to like walk down the street and be like, I need a new book to read, and I want to leave this book behind. These things are no different. People deserve things because we are alive and walking the earth, not because we meet a metric of neediness. That's really like where, in the last few years, through like racial education, through learning about myself as a white woman, through learning about like the power structures, I've really come to just be really expansive with the whole concept. Like, every time I find a roadblock where I'm like, oh wait, somebody needs to prove something, I'm like, ooh, that's probably some of my like very white training, And I wasn't raised, to your point earlier, Summer, I wasn't raised in a religious household. And I do think that like, this is a whole other conversation we probably don't really have that much time left for, but I do think that religion, Christianity in particular in this country, has played a huge role in how white people are socialized, in what they think their job is as a human, how to be a good human, what being free means, who's worthy, who is deserving. We set that standard. A lot of America sets that standard from birth, from the first time they take their children to church and bounce them on their knee through these sermons that kind of grind these ideas in their head of what's good and what's not good. These ideas are set very early on. So I wasn't raised in a household like that. So I think some of the transition that I've personally made was probably just easier because I wasn't also breaking down religious indoctrination.
Yeah, it's definitely my history. But I just want to recap like what you said, because it filled my heart like so much, and just that essence of, we don't need to have anyone prove their need, and this is a really beautiful sentiment. I think that I would love to continue the conversation with you at like another time, and that being the launching point, because there's so much in terms of equity. It's like we do ask people to prove their lack, their need, their, even the way we ask Native Americans to prove their indigenous bloodline. Like, we don't ask anyone else to take a blood test.
Yeah.
So
and even
it fills my heart that you have found this place, in working in your community and in the world to just share. And that, I think that's what we all need to work. And I think your path, it's just been so beautiful to talk with you today, because your path really just lays out like the process, this 20 something year process of like what it looks like, to go through this anti-racist education, like really working. And I know you're not done. I know you're like always,
Yeah, for sure.
continuing your education and sharing and having conversation. But thank you so much because you inspire me like immensely. And yeah, it I'm so incredibly grateful to have you as a resource, as a friend, and to be able to share you with some of the
Yeah,
things.
you're welcome. The only other thing I would end on or say is, what we briefly touched on this is that it's been really impactful for me to listen to and follow and read um, people of color who are saying things in a way that's harsh, maybe, that's hard to read. And at least for white people, it's not actually made for me. And then reading all the comments on that as well, because the education that you can get from smart people who know more than you about things, and the resources I found buried in comments. And, when I work through that first level of feeling of, not wanting to hear some of this stuff, has been that's where I know like my education is nowhere near done. I mean, that's what it is, right? Education, learning is a lifelong thing. Like we both really absorb and appreciate the idea of life learning, of whole life learning, right? Like you learn from experiences, you learn from doing, you learn from wanting to know more than from people like cramming things into your head. So while it was a long process for me to get to the point where I was actually like learning, it came from the years of dumping. And I'm hoping that people will maybe like accelerate that a little bit more. Like they won't have to go through a 10-year guilt period. If we could like move that along a little faster. I was very privileged to have somebody love me enough to put up with my guilt for 10 years before finally making the move forward. But yeah, I think like if we could just get to a place where we understand that like equity is possible, but white people, we probably are not the best people to be telling people what is equitable. You were talking earlier about like white women changing the world. I actually think like we will change the world by becoming better listeners, by like staying in our lane. I think come in hot and heavy. I do all the time, come in hot and heavy, and I'm like, this is how we should do things. But the people who have been living these experiences, while they might not need to be doing all the emotional labor for us, they have a pretty good idea a lot of times about how things could be better and how they could change, and what small things could help make meaningful change to a lot of people. And sometimes that's just like strictly mutual aid, like literally giving money directly to somebody, a direct aid ask. I do it frequently all year long. I give money, and I don't know these people at all. I just follow some folks on Facebook that are like, hey, I have an ask for this person. And that was my introduction to learning how to just give people stuff without trying to decide if they were worthy of it or not. Like they're worthy because they need it. They asked, they need it. I don't need to know what happens to it afterwards. I don't care what they do with it. They said they need it. I give $20, that just became part of my practice. But it took a lot of breaking down of those ideas of like what is equitable. I think you were actually the first person to tell me the word equity. So an equitable a long time ago when you guys, this is really kind of funny, but when you released, you bought insects at I think you and Edwin like bought a bunch of bugs at a store, like a pet store, and you released them, and we had this whole talk. I was like, wow, that is so odd. Like did not even understand it. And you were talking to me a lot about like equity and living in a more equitable life. And I had never really heard that word. So I think you actually introduced me to that concept many years ago. See, you planted a seed that grew into something for me. So hopefully we do that. That's probably the best we can hope for, really, is that we're like planting seeds for people, and that like it's like an oak tree. Sometimes it's a slow grower, but eventually it will be something that's like benefiting the soil and providing shade and providing a lot of food for the ecosystem, if we're talking like from the plant perspective.
Yeah. And like we're like mycelium, and we're all connected, and it's like spreading in the
Right.
in the collective sphere of
Yeah,
connectivity.
absolutely.
The more we talk about it, the more it's out there and the more normalized it becomes. And will you share, Risa? Will you share some links and things that were helpful for you, even the podcast that you mentioned, so we can kind of connect that, and anything else that you'd like to share with people who might be interested
Absolutely.
in digging a little deeper?
Yeah, absolutely. I sure will. Some of the things I'll share are people to follow on Facebook. So, that's an old people thing. If you're super young and you don't do the Facebook anymore, I can try to find their Twitter handles. I think some of the deeper conversations do happen on Facebook, just because that's where a lot of the academics reside. But those are the educational conversations I've been allowed to sit in on and listen and learn from, that were really powerful. So keep in mind, some of the links will be like directly to people to follow.
Cool. Thank you so much.
You're welcome. Thank you. Thanks for letting me talk at great length about something I'm also pretty passionate about. A whole bunch of stuff I'm passionate about.
Yeah, I'm so grateful for this. It's been super helpful. So thanks everyone for tuning in, and yeah, we'll see you again soon.
Thank you.